Okay, here is the part 2 video for the 4.12 lesson, and continuing here with Selma and voting rights. Although the Freedom Summer of 1964 was over, after the 1964 election, many civil rights leaders continued to push for new laws that would ensure black voting rights. Early in 1965, their efforts came to the national attention in the city of Selma, Alabama. Of the 15,000 blacks of voting age living in Selma at the time, only about 350 had managed to register to vote. Bloody Sunday. On March 7, 1965, about 600 people set out to make the 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. They were marching both to demand voting rights and to protest the recent shooting of a young black man at a civil rights demonstration. They did not get far. At the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the route out of Selma towards Montgomery, they encountered Selma's sheriff, his deputies, and a mass of state troopers. The marchers were ordered to stop. They paused, then moved on. The police and state troopers closed in with tear gas, chains, and cattle prods to beat the marchers back. And here's a picture of some of the march. The ABC television network broke into its regular broadcast to televise scenes from the bridge. The news bulletin from Selma interrupted Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about the trial of Nazi war criminals after World War II. Many viewers saw the bitter irony. Just 20 years earlier, the United States had gone to war to defeat a racist enemy, but now Americans were witnessing racial injustices at home. Television coverage of Bloody Sunday, as the day came to be known, transformed the violence against the marchers into support for their cause. We shall overcome. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. led marchers to the Pettus Bridge. Troopers were waiting. The marchers stopped, prayed, and sang, "We shall overcome." Then they turned back. But their cause had gained strength. Television coverage of the brutalities inflicted on the first marchers roused the public support that Johnson needed to push for passage of the voters' rights legislation. Johnson seized the moment. On March 15th, in a televised speech to Congress, he compared the Selma marchers to the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord and urged passage of the Voting Rights Act. Rarely in any time, said the president, does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we shall have failed as a people and as a nation. Johnson went on to emphasize that the matter at hand was not a racial or regional issue, but an American issue. There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. And we have met here tonight as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. Then in a dramatic moment, Johnson invoked a hymn that had been identified with the civil rights movement, and he said, "We shall overcome." By speaking these particular words, LBJ emphasized the struggle for black freedom had become a struggle for America's soul. Shortly after Johnson's speech, a third march set out from Selma. Johnson provided troops to protect the marchers on their way to Montgomery. When they left Selma on March 21st, the marchers numbered about 3,200. By the time they reached Montgomery on March 25th, their numbers had swelled to some 25,000. On the steps of the state capitol, King delivered a powerful speech. I know some of you are asking today, how long will it take? Not long, because no lie can live forever. Hours after King spoke his hopeful words, Ku Klux Klansmen struck again that very night. They murdered Viola Liuzzo, a white woman from Michigan who had come south to help the marchers. Johnson went on television to announce the horrible crime. In August 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation removed obstacles such as literacy tests and poll taxes, and empowered the federal government to take over county voter registration offices if local officials refused to comply with the new law. Over the next 4 years, a number of black voters in the South rose from 1 million to 3.1 million. Southern politics were transformed. Blacks would soon gain representation from the village level to Washington. As Johnson predicted, the region's white majority shifted its allegiance to the Republican Party. From Malcolm X to Black Power. Since the days of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, leaders in the struggle for black civil rights had disagreed on the most effective approaches. By 1965, some black leaders were disagreeing with Martin Luther King Jr. While King, who had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in the preceding year, was revered and respected by millions of Americans, His critics charged that his approach was too cautious and would never convince whites to accept blacks as equals. The most charismatic black leader to emerge in the opposition to King was Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, the son of a Baptist minister. His father died when Malcolm was 6. His mother raised a family in terrible poverty. While Malcolm was a teenager, his mother was committed to an insane asylum, and he went to live with a foster family. He turned to a life of street crime, drug dealing, and robbery. While in prison from 1946 to 1952, he joined the Nation of Islam, a movement that combined elements of Islamic religion with an agenda promoting black pride and self-reliance. The Black Muslims, as they were sometimes called, regarded whites as devils. The Nation of Islam found a following among poor urban blacks in the North. While in prison, Malcolm followed the Nation of Islam custom by replacing his surname Little with X to indicate a rejection of a name probably inherited from white slave owners. In the prison library, Malcolm X undertook an intense course of self-education, reading constantly. When he left prison and rose to prominence within the Nation of Islam, he gained national attention with his brilliant and furious eloquence directed equally against segregationists, white liberals, and mainstream black leaders. In contrast to King's philosophy of nonviolence and civil disobedience, Malcolm told his followers, "If you live in a society and it doesn't enforce its own law because of the color of a man's skin, then people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice." Malcolm X rejected King's integrationist goals and argued for black separatism. "The American Negro has been unhappily married to the U.S. for 400 years, he once told a reporter. "We can't get along, so let's be intelligent and get a divorce. But let's have a property settlement. Give us our share of what the overall joint property is worth." Eventually, he broke with the Nation of Islam's supreme leader, the mysterious Elijah Muhammad. In Africa, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca and became a mainstream Sunni Muslim. Malcolm X took a new name, Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He began to speak of a broader vision of racial harmony and human rights. Then in 1965, while delivering a speech in Harlem, he was assassinated by Elijah Muhammad's elite guards. Black Power. As continuing massive resistance revealed the stubborn persistence of white racism, the arguments of Malcolm X appealed to young militants fed up with nonviolent tactics. One of these was Stokely Carmichael, a radical who challenged and defeated John Lewis, a follower of King, for the chairmanship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966. Carmichael wanted blacks to exclude whites from the protests and organize their own political party. He called for black power. The Black Power message expressed the anger felt by many African Americans who concluded that nonviolence had brought only limited gains and that racism had twisted the basic social and economic structures of American society. The idea of Black Power motivated radical groups such as the Black Panthers, who urged but never tried armed revolution. Led by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Black Panthers advocated armed resistance, but also provided crucial social services in communities like Oakland, California, where they ran school breakfast programs for poor children. Cities aflame. In the inner cities of the North, impoverished African Americans heard reports of civil rights victories far away, but could see little evidence of improvement in their own lives. Their neighborhoods were decaying. Whites fleeing to the suburbs left shuttered stores and closed factories behind them. Jobs grew hard to find. With tax revenues falling, schools and city services declined. Many public housing projects built in optimistic bursts of urban renewal had become drug-infested ghettos. White-dominated city police departments were mistrusted, often despised for frequent harassment of, even brutality against the black community. The federal government had played a part in creating this poverty. Agencies like the Federal Housing Administration permitted banks to deny mortgages to blacks who wished to purchase homes in new suburban communities. The government also looked the other way as employees relegated black men and women to the most menial jobs. Poverty, overcrowding, and crime made black urban neighborhoods across the country ready to burst into violence at the slightest spark. In August 1965, in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts, the sparks flared when a white highway patrolman got into an altercation with an uncooperative black motorist. A crowd gathered and rumors spread, triggering 6 days of shooting, burning, and looting. Buildings were torched to cries of "Burn, baby, burn!" 34 people were killed in the worst urban disorder in decades. Much of the violence was black against white, with onlookers yelling, "Get Whitey!" and "Kill." In Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, violence flared in 1967, both times again when white police were seen as exerting undue force against blacks. The pattern was repeated in dozens of cities over several summers: clashes with authorities, police overreaction, arson and looting, fires and death. Whether one called these disorders riots or rebellions, they both left cities devastated and discouraged both blacks and whites who hope for the better. Our nation is moving toward two societies, declared a federal commission appointed to study the disorders, one black, one white, separate but unequal. Unanswered questions. By 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had begun to focus on the intertwined problems of race and poverty. He came to believe that while it was one thing to legislate the desegregation of parks, restaurants, and voting booths, it was another thing and much more difficult to lift urban African Americans out of poverty. That would require a more comprehensive strategy aimed at securing more open housing, better wages for all workers, both black and white, and a robust labor movement. King made plans to organize a Poor People's March on Washington in the spring of 1968, but he was called away to Memphis to support a strike among sanitation workers who were demanding the right to earn a living wage. King made a second trip. Oh, I'm going to start crying already. King made a second trip to Memphis on April 3rd. There he concluded his speech by saying, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that as a people we will get to the promised land." Early the next evening, April 4th, King stepped out on the balcony of a second-story hotel room. A shot rang out. The single bullet killed Martin Luther King Jr. His death ignited violent outbreaks in dozens of cities. The struggle continues. King's death left questions unanswered. With overt legal discrimination undone, could the deeper patterns of racism be changed? Could whites come to regard blacks as true equals, and could blacks come to trust whites? While these questions remained, there was no doubt that in little more than a dozen years, the work of King and his colleagues had brought enormous advances for American blacks. The civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s was one of the great reform campaigns of American history. It exposed the terrible pain inflicted by Americans infected with racial hatred and turned that pain to far-reaching good. It required the combined efforts of remarkable black leaders, ordinary black citizens, sympathetic white citizens, and the federal government to bring about long overdue changes. The successes of the civil rights movement, however, incomplete, show that what could be accomplished by people acting out of conscience and dedicated to democratic ideals. Oh, I get so emotional, sorry. And then here is a picture of Martin Luther King's funeral procession. Marching in the streets. Okay, and that is the last page for the lesson and the reading. So we will continue with the next part. Freedom can't wait. Yes, and how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? Bob Dylan wrote these lyrics in 1962 as part of his song, Blowin' in the Wind. The words sum up how many black leaders felt in the 1960s. They were ready for change and willing to take another approach to civil rights activism. Follow the directions of the student guide to begin. Okay, we already read today's lesson. And then we had this activity, civil rights movement. Well, let's look at the big idea as well. Remember this, political leaders in the executive and legislative branches and judicial leaders in the Supreme Court used the power of the federal government to change the status quo and guaranteed the full rights of citizenship to black Americans. The civil rights movement opened educational, political, and economic doors for minorities, but some issues of equality and opportunity remain unresolved. Okay, hopefully we'll have time to finish this lesson. Don't forget to go and check your answers on the reading guide with the lesson answer key if you haven't already. Actually, we're going to stop this video and I'll continue the online activity, the civil rights movement, in the part 3 video. So see you in a bit.